cloud so I don't have a giant file on my computer later. Okay. All right, well, we'll start with the few and the faithful that are here. Okay. Oh, look, it says one person's watching it live. How neat. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. We're on Dangerous Love Module 8. So we're coming to the end here. And before we begin, does anyone have any questions for me from our small group? No, everyone here is prepared. Everyone here is ready. Everyone here has gotten work off specifically to come to this. That's dedication. If you're watching this as a recording, just think about that. If you're watching it live on Facebook, I think you're still good. Okay, here we are, reconciliation. So we've talked about reconciliation before. This is not our first time discussing this topic. Does anyone remember? I don't know if anyone was here on those earlier ones that we talked about. It was a while ago, but if you were here, does anyone want to give us a recap, a little bit of what that was about when we previously talked about reconciliation? If no one was here for that, though, that's okay. I can just tell you. That's what it looks like. That's what it looks like right now. Okay, so when we talked about reconciliation previously, we talked about it in the context of our different approaches to conflict. Oh, look, someone else has joined. Someone else probably saw what I said on the live feed and was like, wow, I need to join that group. Okay, there we go. Anyway, when we talked about reconciliation before, we focused on it as an approach to conflict. And so we talked about the smog view and cocoon views of ways that we see conflict in general, kind of overcoming our fear of conflict in general. And reconciliation was the pinnacle, if you will, of conflict approaches. It's where we have a deep-seated view of conflict from that cocoon perspective, where we see it as this constructive, positive force that, well, at least that it can be in our lives. And we didn't go into too much more depth there, other than that's really the ideal. That's the goal. That was, we talked about maps back then, and that's the destination that we want to get to, is to get to reconciliation in our relationships. And so today we're going to be talking a little bit more about what reconciliation is, why it's so critical to dangerous love, and also how to actually practice it. Oh, look, another person. One of the professors has decided to join us. Look at that. Okay, sorry for all the distractions. I really need to get someone else to be like a co-host on here to let people in, so I don't have to keep exiting out of the PowerPoint. But that's okay. We have plenty of time today. So if we look at dangerous love, or not dangerous love, we look at reconciliation of where it kind of fits into our map, or kind of our whole process of dangerous love. We're on step 4. We're on inviting others to turn. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today, how reconciliation plays into that step. But before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit more about why reconciliation is so important. Because if you remember, maybe not, because it seems like, I don't know if anyone came to that day. But when we talked about conflict approaches, we talked about conflict transformation as a positive, constructive cocoon view of conflict. But then we talked about reconciliation as kind of, the greater of the two, if you will. And so I think thinking about what we're going to talk about first is why we need to go even beyond conflict transformation to conflict reconciliation, and why that's so necessary. So first thing we're going to do is think back to our conflict tornado. Now, was anyone here for that particular day? Does anyone remember the conflict tornado? I would like to maybe give us a brief recap of what that's about. It's okay if no one was here for that one either. I can also just...
I was there for that one.
Tara, would you like to give us a little bit? You don't have to tell us everything, but you could just give us a little bit of a recap of what that's about.
Sure, I'll try to do my best here. It was kind of like I do something or they do something, and so then I do something, then they do something, then I do it back, and it just kind of keeps going back and forth and back and forth.
Perfect. That's a great way to describe it. Yeah, it's this back and forth that goes on when we're in a destructive conflict spiral. And so the way I always like to think about it is that the conflict tornado is how we explain destructive conflict escalation. And so just like you said, Tara, it starts off, they do something that, is maybe offensive to us or hurtful to us. it invites us to see them as an object or as an it. And so we respond accordingly to them. But then when we treat them as an object, it causes them, invites them to see us as an object again and do more of whatever it is that was bothering us or hurtful to us before. They do more of that back to us, and then it just continues to escalate and get this bigger and bigger conflict. And so that's one of the ways that the conflict tornado escalates conflict. And then the second way, we talked about that is that we invite allies. So if you've read Anatomy of Peace, this is very similar to collusion in a couple ways. It's one way to think about it. But we also invite allies where we tell other people our side of the story of the conflict, and it causes and invites them to see the person we're in conflict with as an object, and then they get sucked in and it just gets bigger and bigger. So the conflict tornado is, first off, a tool that we can use to help us understand the conflicts in our life, why they turn destructive, and what that looks like. But it also can be used as a kind of a metaphor for conflict in general, especially destructive conflict. And so I think this is also even a little bit fitting considering the events of the last few days here in Hawaii with all the flooding. But the question that we can ask ourselves thinking about this as a metaphor is that just because a storm subsides doesn't mean everything is back to normal where that storm was. And so, if you live in Laie or you live in Hawaii right now with all the flooding, a lot of people lost a lot of possessions. Their homes were flooded. If you think about this as a literal tornado, you can think of a tornado goes through a town or it goes through a home, those things probably aren't going to be the same. And so storms leave wreckage. People are often hurt. And that doesn't really just go away because the storm actually subsided and ended. And so when we take this and think about the conflict tornado, we think about destructive conflict. What we've learned so far in Dangerous Love is how to end the storm. And so we've talked about how we overcome our fear of conflict. We overcome our fear of people that we're in conflict with, and that helps us turn first and make that most dangerous move to start seeing them as a person and start trying to engage them in constructive conflict. And when we make that decision and we start that process, we are ending the tornado. We are ending the storm. But if we're going to truly love dangerously, we can't be content with just ending the storm. We have to understand that doesn't mean that everything is okay again. Everything's back to normal because, like we've talked about, people are often hurt because of that storm. And there's really these consequences that we need to address. And so that's the why of reconciliation. Oh, look, another person. Look at that. Oh. There we go. And so that explains to us, oh, wait, I have a question. Cindy.
Hi. So the difference between collusion and a conflict tornado is that, they're very similar, but that the conflict tornado has, you have allies. And so then there's just more people involved and there's just more damage done. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that the primary difference we're going to look at is seeing them as theories is one, the extension we're making right now of the destructive potential of a storm and a tornado. But then also, I think it's just the escalatory thing. If you think about the collusion diagram, it's those 4 boxes. It kind of just, it's more cyclical. I don't think it demonstrates the escalatory thing as specifically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, more of a cycle than a spiral.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Any other questions? Okay, great. I like this. We're getting questions. Look at that. Okay. And we talked about that. Okay. So that's the why of reconciliation. So now we're moving on to the how. So we want to engage in reconciliation. We want to know, what do we do once we've turned first? How do we start this process? And in order to do that, we're going to talk about the 4 strands of reconciliation. Now, this, again, we want to go back to the original context. We talked about reconciliation. It's a conflict approach. It's a holistic way. Oh, look at that. Oh, look at all these people coming in. I think I got.
DK, if you want to make me co-host, I can let them in for you.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Maybe it's more trouble, but.
No, it's less trouble. I was just saying that. I think maybe before you came in, that would actually be.
Right. You said I thought maybe people were done coming in, but.
That's okay. Following the sense, Manda.
All right.
Okay, so you're co-host now, so you should be able to let people in from now on. Great. Where was I at? First transaction. So we're talking about how, so it was the original context that we talked about reconciliation, which is a conflict approach. And so when we think about reconciliation, there's a couple ways we can think about applying it in our life. First off, at least these 4 strands. One, we can think about it, where we are right now. If there's a conflict in our life, we can start doing this now and approaching the conflict in that way. It doesn't necessarily have to happen after we've made the most dangerous move that we start applying this. It can be before, and it can even help us do that step of making the most dangerous move. And so we're going to kind of talk about this in the whole sense that we can apply this anywhere in the conflict. But ultimately, the purpose of it is going to be partly to help us turn, but also it's going to be towards that 4th step of the dangerous love process, which is helping and inviting others to turn towards us. And so there's a lot of ways we can apply it, but we're going to talk primarily about the consequence or the end result of this. So here are the 4 strands. So we have truth, mercy, justice, and peace. And each of these strands is a critical component of reconciliation. So we're going to start with truth. Would someone like to read this quote for us? Morgan, thank you.
TK says truth. Dangerous love requires us to be open to the alternative, expanded stories about both of us, stories that expose both our weaknesses and of our worth, stories that open us up to the idea that we are involved in the same sorts of self-deceptions that invite us to see others as its.
Okay, great. And so this is kind of focusing on stories and the narratives we tell ourselves when we're in conflict. Now, maybe you guys, I think we talk about this a lot in peace building. What do you guys remember as the significance of stories and narratives when we're in conflict?
They change depending on who's telling it.
Oh, great comment. It changes depending on who's telling it, especially which side of the conflict's telling it. Great. Other thoughts on that?
It also frames the conflict. So however we perceive something is usually how we're going to interpret the other person will react. Or in the case of conflict tornado, we can let it escalate by already kind of anticipating what the other person is going to do.
Great. Yeah, and so it definitely funnels into that conflict tornado, and it can cause us to even preemptively decide, we know what this other person's going to do. Great. And so we're focusing on here, the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we often, we tell other people about the conflict that we're in. Now, just like Lena was saying, depending on who you ask about the conflict, the story is going to change, especially when you have those 2 conflicting sides. Our story, if I'm in conflict with someone, my side's going to be painting me as the hero and them as the villain. And their side's going to be the opposite. It's going to paint themselves as the hero and me as the villain. And so part of what truth is recognizing that when we tell ourselves these stories, they're incomplete in 2 main ways. They're incomplete in what they tell us about the other person and also what they tell us about ourselves. And if you remember, if you were here for self-deception, this is right in line with what we talked about, how self-deception deceives us and causes us to engage in these destructive conflict and have fear about other people. And so the strand of truth is really oriented about helping us overcome the self-deception we're experiencing as part of that conflict. And this can help us both make that most dangerous move, but also after to invite others. And so the core concept we're dealing with here is moving from me to we. This idea of self-preservation to us preservation. How do we focus from asking ourselves and telling the story just with me in mind to having we in mind? And so we're going to look at a couple questions here. And so there's some important things to recognize about these questions. When we're asking ourselves these, we want to focus on the we perspective. The way these questions are going to be set up is it's going to have, what am I going through? And you'll see the second one is what are they going through? And both the answer to both these questions is actually important, because when we want to deal with real reconciliation, we want to deal with real collaboration, it's important for us to recognize that we have needs, that we may have been wronged in conflict. We're not ignoring that in reconciliation. But what we're moving from is this narrative that we've told ourselves that only focuses on that only focuses on the wrongs that have been done to us, and moving towards understanding and adding to that story also the wrongs that we may have done to the other person. And so what we're going to do is we're going to spend a few minutes on these questions. What I want everyone to do is take a second and maybe think about someone who you've had conflict with, or even better, who you're in conflict with right now. And this could be a conflict you feel like you've already made progress in. Maybe you don't feel like it's destructive anymore. You may even have gone through this process. But whenever you want to take out a piece of paper, or if you're on your computer, you can type this out. And first off, think of one of those relationships, but then ask these questions about that conflict. Especially we want to focus on the we question, because generally we already know enough about the first one. We already have told ourselves continually what the first one is. And so we want to focus on the second question here, the we question. What are they going through? There's 3 questions we'll go through, so we'll give everyone a minute. No, we're not going to share these, so these are just for you. But take a second, think about that, and then I'll go to the next question in a minute. And if anyone has any questions about that or this in general, feel free to ask that too. I'm just going to go to the next question, but if you're still working on that one, you can keep writing answers to that one. And so the second question we're going to look at is, how is this conflict making my life hard versus, and especially the we question here, how is this conflict making their life hard? Question here. Okay, and then we'll look at the last question again. You can keep working on those previous questions, but this is the last one. In what ways have others added to my pain is the me question, and the we is, in what ways have added to our pain? And this one's phrased just slightly differently, our pain rather than their pain, just because we want to emphasize that, especially when we think about the conflict tornado, that sometimes the ways we've acted have not only, obviously added pain to them, but sometimes we've actually added to our own pain in the process. We've actually invited them to do more of the thing that we said we hated in this process. And so also be thinking about the ways our actions have kind of come back in the tornado to us as well. Does anyone need more time or want more time rather to kind of go through this?
Okay, I just have a question.
Yeah, great.
I'm not sure if I'm missing something. So I notice in these questions that they're about me, but then the other ones are about them specifically. But in this last one here, it says, in what ways have I added to our pain? So that's now about us. So where did that turn happen, going from me to them to us?
Yeah, great question.
I don't know if I actually asked it well.
No, I think I understand your question, and you can tell me if I'm missing it here. So first off, when we're talking about the me and we, so we can go back one. How is this conflict making my life hard to how is this conflict making their life hard? What we're trying to capture here is that both these questions are actually important to the we perspective. We want to keep in mind, we can be honest and we can know and even voice how the conflict has made our own life hard. It's important for us to value our own needs in the conflict. We talked about that back in conflict styles. But normally what we're missing in the stories that we tell ourselves and the truth is we're not normally missing how is it making our life hard, but rather how is it making their life hard. And so what we're doing is we're adding to the first question. And when we add those two questions together, that actually creates the we perspective. When we understand both how it's made our life hard and how it's made their life hard, and we place value and we care about both those things. But in this last one that you're asking, we've added that R at the end. So now it's not how, in what ways have I added to their pain. And the distinction here is just that, first off, we do want to understand how we've added to their pain. But I think the additional insight here is that some of the times the way we've acted in a conflict, especially if we've been engaged in a conflict tornado and spiral, is that we've not only, and I guess we could have added this to any of the questions. I think this one was just particularly, we thought, impactful with this. Some of the ways we've acted have actually added to our own pain. And so now it's kind of an extra question of, in what ways have they added to my pain? In what ways have I added to their pain? And in what ways have I actually added to my own pain? And so it's kind of trying to encapsulate all those questions there. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. So it's like a little more broad, I guess.
Yeah, it's a little bit more broad because we're trying to cover a little bit more in that question.
Okay. No, thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Any other questions for me about this section? Okay, great. Okay, so there's truth. So now the next thing we're going to do, and we're going to do this for all the strands, and the rest of them, I promise, are going to be a little bit shorter. We're not going to have kind of an activity like that for each of them. But this is the primary thing we're going to do for each of them. So I want everyone to take a second, and we're going to do these three things. So first off, we're going to think of a behavior that supports this strand of reconciliation, that promotes truth in the relationships we have, and especially those that we're in conflict with. Then we're going to think of a behavior that contradicts this strand of reconciliation, something that if we did would get in the way of us being able to have truth there. And then we're going to decide how you can better support the strand with those that you're seeking reconciliation with. And so again, we'll just take a minute and we'll think about these things. And, for me, I think, and this can be general. If you were thinking of a specific person before and you want to keep thinking about that person, please do. That's a great way to think about these questions. If you can really think of a conflict or anything, it's okay to think about these broadly and generally in relationships and in conflicts. And so I'll give you guys all a minute. Feel free to write down some of your answers to this. Does anyone need more time with that? No? Okay, well, we'll move on. Okay, so as we start to cultivate truth and we try to promote that in our relationships and expand these narratives that we've been telling ourselves, that starts to evoke in us a want and a desire for mercy. And when we're talking about mercy, one thing that's important to recognize about all these steps of all these strands of reconciliation is these are all about, what can we give to the process? How can we promote truth? How can we promote mercy? Rather than thinking about it in the context, how do I receive these things from the other side? And so when we're talking about mercy, we're primarily talking about forgiveness here. And when we're in destructive conflict, especially when we're in the middle of a conflict tornado or some sort of escalated conflict like that, mercy and forgiveness can feel really hard to give. And why do you guys think that is?
I think it's because we feel like we're the victim in the situation.
Great, definitely. We feel like we're the victim of the situation. And so, that like forgiveness and mercy, is not really what's needed here, especially sometimes until they've done something to kind of make up for it. Any other thoughts about that? Why does mercy and forgiveness feel hard to give in destructive conflict?
Because we run the risk of being hurt again.
Great answer. Yeah, a lot of times we feel like, if I put forward that mercy, it can get thrown back in my face, or, I can get more hurt. It's a vulnerable act to try to offer that to somebody else. And it could, the fear can be, if we're going back to our fear of conflict and people, that it's not going to be received well. Any other thoughts about that?
I think just pride in general, not wanting to. Maybe I think people kind of form an attachment to the conflict they're currently in. Sometimes they almost don't. I mean, they want it to be over, but they almost don't want it to be, because then whatever was going on is over, has ended. I don't know if that makes sense.
That's a great point. We don't talk about this as much in these workshops, but it's actually a really good point that sometimes when we're in conflict, we use the word justification. That's the Arbinger term for it. One of the things we actually really want, even though we're not saying we want it, is justification to continue doing what we're doing. And that's why it's called collusion and Arbinger, because we're kind of colluding with each other, agreeing with each other to give each other the justification that they need to continue this process. And so sometimes we might feel like we don't want to engage in reconciliation or give mercy forgiveness because it's going to rob us of our justification. We can't feel like we're the victim anymore. And so that's a great point. And so how do you think this changes when we move from destructive and we start transforming that conflict and engaging in constructive conflict? How do you think mercy and forgiveness starts to feel easier to give in that situation? Well, that's okay if we're not sure. Well, one thing they think is the next thing we're going to read is a little quote that I think for me actually helps encapsulate why it becomes different. And I think part of it's a little bit of a better understanding of what we mean when we say we're going to forgive someone. So this is a quote from Desmond Tutu. Would someone like to read this for us?
I can read it, TK.
Perfect, thanks.
So, mercy. When we forgive, we are declaring our faith in the future of a relationship and in the capacity of the wrongdoer to make a new beginning on a course that will be different from the path that caused us the wrong. We are saying here's a chance to make a new beginning. It is an act of faith that the wrongdoer can change. Desmond Tutu.
Yeah, and so what stands out to you from that quote? How do you think that, reading that, how do you think, going back to the original question that helps us answer it, how does constructive conflict make forgiveness and mercy easier to give?
I think it's a chance to make a new beginning. That's what stands out to me.
Great. That's a great point. This idea of a new beginning that we're having. What other thoughts do you guys have?
I believe it's also like a test. Oops, sorry. I believe it's also like a test of faith because it says like we're declaring our faith in the future. And also that kind of like says we're taking a step in the dark, and that's scary, but we do it anyway because we have faith in what will come.
Great. Amanda, do you have something you wanted to
I think it was the same, maybe adding a little more hope as well, like hope to that faith, hope that the person can change, and just that things can be made to be healed and made right.
Yeah, great. And so, for me, what this makes me think about is one of those steps of dangerous love is changing how we see people. And when we're in destructive conflict, we really don't believe in the capacity of the wrongdoer to change or do anything different than what they're currently doing. And part of practicing dangerous love is starting to believe that that isn't completely true. Part of truth, that step is starting to understand that there's more to that person than the wrongs that they have done to us. And so as we begin to practice dangerous love, as we begin to practice constructive conflict, we start to believe that there is good in that person, that there is the potential for them to actually make these changes, and for us to have that new beginning, just like Lena talked about. And so it's easier to feel like we can forgive. It's easier to feel like we can offer mercy because now we no longer believe, I think it was Mackenzie maybe that said it, we no longer believe that that's just going to get thrown back in our face. And, it's not going to be reciprocated. We start to believe that it can actually be reciprocated too. Someone have a question here, Cindy?
Yes, I just had a comment. I don't know if this is like, if there's a theory about this, but so I kind of think that if we don't even think that about ourselves, like if we think our wrongdoings and our contributions to the conflict are part of our identity, then how can we even separate those things from the other party? And so I think part of this is declaring our faith in the future of a relationship. So both of us, like both participants, not just the other person can change, but that I can change too. Because if we think that, like if we don't think that they can be more than their mistakes, then we don't think that of ourselves either. So then the change isn't going to happen at all.
It's a beautiful point to make, especially, when we read this quote. I think when we read the word wrongdoer, we're thinking of the other person, but we can equally apply that to ourselves. We have faith in the future in relation to the capacity of the wrongdoer. That can be us too. And so mercy can also be an act of faith that we as the wrongdoer can change. And so I think that's a great point. Any other thoughts about this? Okay, well, we'll keep going. And so with all of them, we're going to do this. So let's think about it. Take a minute and think about a behavior that supports mercy, and also a behavior that we could engage in that would contradict mercy, and then decide if we can better support that strand with those that we're seeking reconciliation with. I don't know if you can hear the chickens, but they're very noisy here today. That one's really, we'll close that window back there to maybe make it a little more quiet.
No, it's good. It's okay.
Do you guys like it? You guys like the chicken?
I think if
I
you're
do.
being annoyed and woken up in the morning, then you don't hate chickens as much as I can handle it more.
Fair enough. Well, at least it's not. Sometimes it's right out. So there's a window right in front of me. Sometimes it's right outside that window, and that's the worst. I can tell you. Anyway, I don't need to talk about the conflict I have with that chicken. There's one specific chicken that I feel like always is out there. He's kind of like a blonde chicken, and I feel like I recognize him, and he's always the one that's right by the window. Anyway, sorry.
I think it's a rooster.
Have mercy.
I do need to work on having mercy with that chicken. There's definitely, I've discussed getting a BB gun to hunt that chicken. But anyway, that's destructive conflict. That's an example. I go chase him outside and chase him into somebody else's yard, and he comes back and he has more roostering to do. So anyway, we're getting off topic here. So that's mercy. We talked about mercy. So this is now fitting. We're going to talk about justice because anyway right now. But so as we start to cultivate mercy and have this desire to extend mercy, we also start to have a desire for justice. Now, when we normally think about justice, I think the first thing that comes to my mind, at least, is punishment. And we can think about wanting punishment for others, or sometimes even, hopefully, at this point, we're recognizing the wrongs that we've committed. We could also be thinking about in the context, how do we get punished? But the justice that dangerous love is about is not about the justice of punishment, but about the justice of restitution. And so let's see, does someone want to read this quote here that's going to help capture that for us?
I will. For us simply to do our own personal work so that we feel better about our others and ourselves through truth and mercy is not enough. In addition, we feel the need to make right to the best of our ability and capacity what we and sometimes others help to make wrong.
Okay. And so that's the justice we're trying to capture here, is to make right to the best of our ability the things that we and others help make wrong. So if we go back to truth, if we thought about some of the questions we asked ourselves when we were on that segment and that strand of reconciliation, we hopefully learned some ways that we added to others' pains and our own pain. And we're starting to ask ourselves, what can I do now to make that right? Does anyone have any questions about that or thoughts to add on to that?
I had a lot more on my list of ways that I have added to our pain. So I think that kind of sucks, but it's one way to realize your part in the conflict.
Yeah, definitely. It's part of how we recognize it. And I think it does, like, this is probably, I think for me at least, and I think all these steps can be, different ones can be more difficult for people. I think for me, this is probably the hardest one to feel like to engage in, because I just think it's hard to, I feel like in some ways it's kind of just truth taken to the next step, where like I really do have to confront, not only in my own mind what I've done and kind of, admit to myself and be like, okay, I can admit to myself that's not done, but now I actually need to go do something about it. And in some ways I feel like, it makes it, I don't know, maybe more public. I don't know exactly, but I feel like for me, at least this is one of the most difficult parts of this, is to really work on that restitution of things that have been lost. And so let's think about a behavior that we can maybe do that can support justice, a behavior that would contradict justice, and then we can decide on how we can support that strand in the relationships we have. Okay, does anyone need any more time with that? Okay, great. So as we seek that restorative justice, we go to the last strand of this, which is peace. And interesting thing about this, you can see it kind of becomes this cycle now that we engage in. of reconciliation. And that's because what peace is really about, this step, and this is mostly how we talked about it when we were back in conflict approaches, is it's this consistent effort that we put forward to try to make sure that in the future with this person that we're in conflict with, when conflict arises again, because, we recognize conflict is just a natural part of relationships. How do we prevent ourselves from going back to the destructive conflict and going back towards the conflict tornado? What can we do now while we're in a good space to start promoting this process in the future? How can we make sure that next time this happens, we go through truth, we go through mercy, we go through justice, instead of back to the other cycle? And so I guess this is kind of a different cycle that we want to keep going. And so, as always, here's our quote, kind of to help us think about it. This quote might seem even a little bit more vague, I guess. It's from Viktor Frankl. It's the quote heading for the chapter in Dangerous Love about this. But would someone like to read that for us, and we can talk a little bit about how it relates to this step?
Okay, I'll do it.
Thanks.
Our answer must consist not in talk and mediation, but in right action and in right conduct. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the task which it constantly sets for each individual.
Great. And so we're thinking about how this idea Viktor Frankl's talking about relates to this idea of that continual peace we're seeking. I know, what thoughts do you guys have about how that relates?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. And so it's just, how does this quote relate to the strand of peace, of reconciliation?
I think it kind of goes back to the fact that dangerous love is active and not passive. So peace also has to be active as well.
Great point. Yeah, we need to be active. Like talk and meditation can't be the only thing we do. Cool. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, and it should be consistent, right?
Great. Yeah, highlighting that word consistent there, that there's always going to be this consistent. And I think, again, when we talked about this before in conflict approaches, we talked about cocoon view of conflict, seeing conflict as a constructive force in our lives. And so reconciliation as an approach recognizes that conflict is a natural and common part of our lives. It's the deep-seated cocoon view that we have. And so we recognize that there is this need for a consistent effort and a consistent action to engage in this. Cool. Any other thoughts?
I just think something new kind of stood out to me. I think right away I got a little defensive because I'm like, no, meditation is actually going to really help you get there. And he's not saying it's not part of it, but it's more than that. But then I thought, well, this idea of right conduct reminds me of back to the way of being, like the way we seek peace has to start with who we are. And to get to that space where we can feel like our conduct is going to have that mercy and that forgiving and that calmness is through the meditation. So once you're working on that, that's going to build that confidence so that you can make the right choices to ultimately take that responsibility for yourselves to fix and work through the conflicts with a more peaceful ability. So I don't know if that makes sense, but.
No, that's a great point, because I think, one of the things I think we continually highlight throughout this whole dangerous love process is there's all these, we can think about them as steps or things we go through. And the real danger, or maybe not the danger, but really what dangerous love is trying to help us understand is we need to keep going in a lot of these things. So meditation absolutely can be something that can help us see people as people, get us to these right spaces, all these other things we've been talking about, help us in this process. But the danger is when we stop at one of them and say, now I'm done. I've gotten here to this step and now I'm done. And that's where, when we talked about conflict approaches, even transformation, you can think we've transformed the conflict and the relationship and I'm done. But reconciliation tells us there's more to do. And peace being the last strand in this reconciliation process, we needed to go through all those other things. Those were critical processes of getting here in the first place. But now that we're here, it's not about doing more of that. It's about doing something different. It's about that right conduct. It's about continually engaging in those actions in that process. But it's also important to recognize that we probably couldn't have gotten here without doing those other things first. Great. Any other thoughts? Any other questions here? I like to think, I think for me, the thing that stands out, I just like to I think this is a really interesting quote because I think it's just a lot of things you can take from it about how it relates. I always just think about like the right answers to its problems because there's a lot of different ways we can answer conflict in our lives. And you know, so much of what we've talked about throughout all of these is the wrong ways that we can answer conflict and how we want to avoid that. But I just think, you know, when we're trying to inspire change in ourselves and others, there is a right way to do that. And part of Dangerous Love is understanding and learning about how do we actually be, you know, even if you just want to think about it from the standpoint of being effective, you know, how do we actually help ourselves be able to have constructive conflict? How does that constructive conflict actually be effective in helping ourselves and others? And this is really the right way to do that. And sometimes we think, you know, these destructive ways are going to get us there, but they won't. So that's just something that always stands out to me about this. So that's peace. And so we're going to, again, this is our last one. We're going to think about a behavior that supports this strand of reconciliation, a behavior that contradicts it, and in ways that we can better support the strand of peace in our relationships. Okay, does anyone need any more time on that one? Okay. With that's it for today. And so our invitation to you is, you know, we've thought about a lot of different behaviors. We've listed some for each of them. You know, our invitation is really just to pick one of those for any of those strands and to find a way to apply that in your life and your relationship, especially if there's one that you've been thinking about today that you've been having conflict with, and to try to apply that to approach that conflict with a reconciliation mindset. Before we go, does anyone have any last questions for me? Okay, well, thank you guys for coming. Thank you guys for participating. I look forward, hopefully you guys come next week. Next week's one of my absolute favorite ones to talk about. So I hope you guys come to that one. But I'll see you guys next week, hopefully.
Thank you, TK.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.